Well, good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. Now we come to what I think will be one of the most interesting sort of opening dinner discussions that we've had. For those who got the early version of the program, it had as our speaker David Coltart, and I'll talk about David in a moment. But we thought that we had another guest here who might have an interesting story to tell, much like David. So what we've done is we've invited Paul Kelly to sort of interview these two. They're each going to make a short presentation. The other speaker is our friend from Argentina, and I'll talk about him in a moment as well. So if I could get the three to come up here, and Paul's at the back, Ricardo Lopez Murphy up here, and David Coltart right here. So Paul in the middle, and the other two can have any seat they like. You want to sit on the left and you want to sit on the right? Is that the idea?
I feel comfortable in the right.
When we first sort of thought about this, David Coltart has been to Concilium once before. He came here 3 years ago, and it was at a time when possibly where the country, Zimbabwe, was had reached the bottom of the horrible situation. I mean, some of you, if you came, he came around with I don't know how many billion-dollar notes that he had. I mean, how many billions? He tells me that by the end of it, they had several trillion-dollar notes, but that was after they cut the noughts off. Well, some of the noughts off. 21 noughts off. So I don't even know what that sort of number is. But since then, of course, some sort of sense seemed to prevail, and there was a government of unity formed to try and solve some of the problems. In fact, they dropped the Zimbabwean dollar altogether and used the US dollar. David is now in the cabinet. He is the Minister for Education, Sports, Arts and Culture. So as Minister for Sport, he's been trying various golf courses around the country, and plans to do, if he can, at least one more game before he heads back. It's about the only time he's getting to play golf at the moment. Ricardo Lopez Murphy is from Argentina. Whilst Zimbabwe we know probably more about in a sense because of the British Commonwealth and all that sort of stuff, Argentina we know less about. Ricardo is an economist, professor of economics. He was finance minister briefly. Now, at dinner last night, I was trying to work out how brief it was, but it seemed to be very brief. Because if I understood it, he was made minister. Then they figured out what he actually wanted to do, and that was the end of that. And he also ran unsuccessfully twice for the presidency of his country. Both Zimbabwe and Argentina have had tough political environments for anybody to live under, and I thought it would be useful for us here who mostly live in free societies where we can say what we like, or at least at the moment we can, and the economies work well and so forth, to hear briefly about some of the political environment in which these two countries have to work within. And they will speak each for about 5 minutes, giving a brief outline, some are personal, some not, and then Paul will talk to them and ask questions, and we'll sort of get some conversation going. So I don't know if we actually worked out who's going to be first, did we? Ricardo. So Ricardo, there's a microphone on the table there, and they're all on, I'm told, and it's over to you. So thank you all three, and we look forward to an interesting discussion.
Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I will try to tell you something about my country, to give you an idea of our situation. In 5 minutes it's very difficult, but I will try. I will give you two features of my country that will be interesting for you. First of all, in the 20s of the 20th century, the GDP per capita of Argentina was around 80% of the GDP per capita of Australia. Nowadays, it's 20% of the GDP per capita. You were a very successful country. We were not successful country, to say the least. Maybe the comparison is not the right one because you have a very overvalued currency. I find the price in Sydney incredibly expensive. And maybe if you correct by purchasing power parity, the difference is not so wide, but it's 3.5. The second feature that is interesting for you, and I think you will pay attention to me, is you are the first country to introduce the carbon tax. We are the only country in the world that subsidizes at an incredible level the consumption of energy. I am not sure that the carbon tax is a good idea, but I am sure that subsidizing the consumption of energy is surely a bad idea. Well, our political and institutional framework, if you read our constitution was made at the middle of the 19th century. It's almost a copy of the United States. During a long period of time, we followed the constitutional framework, and we were very successful, and that explains why in the 20s we were so rich. Unfortunately, we suffered a big shock in the First World War and in the recession of the 30s, and we changed from the framework of an open society and an open economy to a corporativist society and to a very closed economy, and that, in my view, explains why we suffer such big difference between our level of life. What is living with an authoritarian government? You listen after myself, a Zimbabwean member of government. I believe it's difficult to compare Argentina with Zimbabwe. We have a light authoritarian government. It's not an extreme authoritarian, it's light. Light, what mean by light? They don't respect the constitution, they don't respect the rule of law. They govern by executive order. We don't have budget, you know. Imagine Australia without budget. We spend what the president wants to spend. In electoral time, then the expenditure is what she needs to win the election. We are in that relation with Australia. Also, a woman is in charge. We don't have budget. They take control of the central bank. We are issuing money at 40% a year. You know, if you issue money at 40% a year, you have to suffer a very high inflation. How our government deal with the inflation? They correct the fiscal policy or the monetary policy? No, they falsify the statistic. We have a make-up with the statistic. And those, I work in one think tank that discover the number, those that discover the right number are persecuted by the government as violating the truth. The truth, I mean, the truth in the sense of authoritarian government. We are a federal country. There is no respect for federalism. The government transfer from the central government are given only to those that behave in according to the wishes of the president. And that destroy in our constitution there are mainly three ways to control government. One is federalism. That is, the central government cannot control everything. The second is the separation of power between the judicial, the Congress, and the executive. And the third is the free press. The three are under attack. The Federalist has been destroyed. The Congress is in the hand of opposition, but as the president governed by executive order, she is able not to pay attention to Congress. And third, the free press is under a very important attack. One of the consequences of closed society and closed economy is we have a very powerful unions, very powerful, incredibly powerful. They provide us with the health insurance. Imagine that money in the hands of unions. Our unions are like the gangster of Chicago. That combination explains a lot our problem. Well, what is our economic system? Our economic system, as I explained, is a combination of corporativism and mercantilism. Let me give an example. The government is able to prohibit every activity through several means. One of them is price control. The other is the control of export. They can forbid export. For example, believe it or not, they have been able to bankrupt our meat package industry. There is no country as efficient as ourselves. I think we produce the best meat in the world. I know that there is a lot provocative here, but I believe so. But we have been able to bankrupt that. It's like you forbid the export of iron or carbon to China and Japan in Australia. It's a crazy policy, but that is the policy. We are under extreme populism. Everybody lives from transfer from the government. I don't have time to explain some of them, but let me give you an example. We have a pension system, and the government let into the pension system as pensioners people that don't pay during the economic life the amount you need to be pensioner. The system is we have one pensioner by every 2 workers. As we have a lot of black market, only 1 worker pay. Imagine what is the sustainability of that system. Now, I know I have to finish. I would like to explain why they defeat me several times in election. Because after what I said, you will think that it's easier to defeat them. I hope you understand something that is very important in politics. I am not teaching you, but I try to give you a good lesson. When a situation improves a lot, we improve a lot because we are like Australia, with a big difference. You are very close to China. We are very far from China. But we have the same natural resource endowment that you have, and we enjoy an incredible tailwind. And that tailwind produces an increase in our resources that grows in a very important way. The people see that the situation improved a lot. They cannot identify if this is due to government management or to improve external parameters. In the doubt, they vote for government because maybe they are the reason of the explanation. The problem for politicians is the key question is causality, but the people observe correlation. Correlation is, for magician, causality for scientists. I try to be scientific in my approach to politics in Argentina, and I was defeated 4 times. I suggest that you try another way. Thank you very much.
I hope this is working. It is. Good evening, everyone. It's interesting to hear some of the parallels. 50 years ago, Zimbabwe had an economy that was bigger than Singapore's. In a Commonwealth sense, Zimbabwe at one stage was considered for dominion status, and so was not far behind Australia and New Zealand. However, the last 50 years have seen the country afflicted by a succession of what can only be described as fascist governments. Not just under Robert Mugabe, let me stress. The problems began in the early 1960s when Ian Smith came to power and declared UDI, drove the country into a bloody civil war. And to sustain that illegal independence, introduced a series of what can only be described as fascist laws. Tight controls of the media, very stringent restrictions on political freedoms, and to sustain a local economy, a rigid tariff structure. Sadly, in 1980, when the first majority rule government took over, they simply perfected those controls. They retained the centralized economy and the tight tariff regime, and they really did perfect the system of draconian political restrictions. That led in turn to a genocide in 1983. It led to growing levels of corruption in the country in the 1990s, and led to the horrors that many of you are aware of in the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, I have been brought into politics. In my previous life, I was a lawyer, and so I have a deep personal knowledge of what has happened in the country's political environment in the last 10 years. All of us who were prepared to stand up to the regime have been subjected to a variety of abuses. I personally lost a political aide who was kidnapped, never seen again. I've been detained. I've survived one assassination attempt. And that has been typical for all my political colleagues. During the last 10 years, the Mugabe regime maintained all these controls, and with the collapsing economy, resorted to the printing of money to sustain their campaign. Of course, that caused hyperinflation. Greg has touched on it, with, at the end of this chapter in our history, a $100 trillion note being produced, with 21 noughts taken off that note. And after a couple of weeks of that note having been produced, it could buy a loaf of bread, if you were lucky. It has led to the almost total collapse of Zimbabwe. And from being a country, as I said earlier, that had an economy stronger than Singapore 50 years ago, it is now one of the poorest countries in the world. That led in 2008, the last time I was here, to the region finally waking up. And I need to acknowledge John Howard here today for the principled stand that he took during our darkest days in pressurizing the Commonwealth and countries like South Africa to do something about Zimbabwe. Finally, the region woke up to the devastating consequences Zimbabwe's collapse could have on the region and forced us, that is 3 political parties, into a transitional arrangement. That resulted in a transitional government in 2009, and I'm pleased to tell you in closing that has yielded tremendous improvements for average Zimbabweans. Inflation has been brought down to 4% this year. We have abandoned our currency and adopted the United States dollar. We face growth of 8.8% this year, albeit off a very low base, but nevertheless, having come from negative growth rates to a positive growth rate is a considerable improvement for us. And certainly as far as exchange controls, we are now one of the freest countries in the world. Our tariffs are coming down. As I say, economy is improving. Children are back at school. Our textbook pupil ratios have come down to 1:1, and we're moving forward. We're not out of the woods yet. I liken Zimbabwe to where South Africa was in the early 1990s. It is a process of transition to a better order. It is fragile. There are hardliners doing their utmost to derail this process because they know that if it continues, it won't lead to a happy end for them. But there is now hope, and there wasn't hope when I was last here in 2008. Thank you.
Good evening. We should remember that Ricardo and David come from extraordinarily different nations, Argentina and Zimbabwe. Yet I think it's fair to say that they are united in a common project, the quest for greater political and economic freedom in the teeth of adversity. Their nations have had turbulent and challenging histories. In a sense, they are an example of politics at the extreme. And I think our 2 guests tonight are a reminder of the need for personal courage in the cause of progress. Ricardo, if I could start with you, you've offered a fairly critical and pessimistic view of the political system in your country. How do you see the future? Do you think that the political system will evolve with a greater respect for rule of law, with a more liberal system, with democracy and democratic processes more deeply entrenched, or do you see either the maintenance of the status quo or a reversion to a more authoritarian form of politics?
My views are influenced by, I have been fighting with our government for a long period of time. I would say I have to be modest, but I'm a freedom fighter. I have been under harassment by them for a long period of time. I believe they can be defeated in the election. And obviously, if they are defeated, we'll come back to something like the rule of law. Not perfect, but I think all the crazy policies and the authoritarian ways of governing Argentina will be finished. But I'm not sure we will defeat her. It's very difficult because, you know, Argentina is enjoying a very good external circumstance, and they have a lot of money to distribute. And if they are under that circumstance, I believe to be optimistic about the defeat of them is not easy, but let me say that we have not a big chance, but for the first time, a chance, because they made so many mistakes that even in this incredible good circumstance, they can be defeated for the first time. If the economy remain, the external parameters remain very good, we will not suffer extreme authoritarian government. Why? We are enjoying an incredible, very good circumstance. All the things that can happen. Argentina is very easy to understand. It's like Australia, very rich in natural resources. We depend a lot on our neighbor. We have a very good, very large neighbor, 5 times Argentina GDP, that is Brazil. Brazil is performing extremely well. We depend a lot on dollar, on American dollar. If the American dollar is strong, we suffer a lot. Let me explain. A strong dollar, I suffer obesity. A strong dollar is like tightening your clothes. A soft dollar is like elastic clothes. I hate the scale to measure my weight because I don't like to know the information. The way that I know if I am overweight or not is if the coat is easy to put on myself. Well, a weak dollar, a weak American dollar, is like elastic clothes. You never discover that you are overweight. We enjoy the weak dollar. We enjoy fantastic commodity price. We enjoy Brazil under an incredible growth process. And finally, we are a country with a lot of problems with property rights. We are the nightmare of creditors. We made the biggest default in history. We didn't do a haircut. We did a scalping. Under that behavior, what do you need? You need a lot of liquidity in capital, a lot of liquidity, no liquidity, a lot, and very low interest rate. Fortunately for us, the interest rate is almost 0, and there are a lot of liquidity. They even buy our bonds to give an idea of what is happening. In my view, those circumstances will remain with us for a long period of time. We will have at world level very low interest rate. We will have a lot of liquidity, not because of Argentina, but because the European financial system, the European fiscal system, the American fiscal system, the American financial system needs very low interest rate. That explains why we have very low interest rate. As these are the 4 main features that affect our economy. As you know, everything, in my view, will be right for us in the next 5, 6, 7 years, except that something happened with China. That will affect a lot Australia and a lot Argentina. I don't foresee that event.
But I mean, to what extent is this a trap? I mean, you've talked about high commodity prices, you've talked about your country benefiting from China's industrialisation, but to what extent might this repeat some of the problems we've seen earlier on in Argentinian history? That is, are we going to see fundamental reforms in society and the political system and the rule of law to underpin economic success?
Okay, I will say, under very good circumstance, it will be very difficult for us to change our ways of working. Why you will change if, despite of all of errors that you make, you enjoy a good standard of living? You change when you discover it's not going well for you.
Precisely, you change during crisis.
Yes, and I don't foresee a very big crisis.
So what conclusion does this lead you to about Argentina?
That it will be very difficult for us to change our situation.
Okay. Just moving to David, you've had a long association, for better or worse, with Robert Mugabe. you now sit in a cabinet with him. I think the audience would like to hear tonight your assessment of him as a man and as a politician.
Well, I've had a long personal association with Robert Mugabe going back literally 30 years. When I was a student leader in South Africa in 1981, I was threatened with deportation by the apartheid regime. Mugabe heard about it as Prime Minister and sent me a personal telegram encouraging me and ironically speaking about a vision of a new democratic Zimbabwe. So you can imagine as a young student I came back full of enthusiasm for Robert Mugabe and came right into the vortex of the genocide which was being perpetrated by him in 1983. And as a young lawyer I ended up representing his political opponents, which brought me into conflict with Robert Mugabe. And that conflict continued and probably got to its worst state in 1998 when he went on national television and declared me to be an enemy of the state. So even before I got into formal politics, I had a troubled relationship with him. And of course, in the last 10 years, that has gone from bad to worse. You'll appreciate that when my party nominated me to become Minister of Education, Mugabe wasn't particularly pleased about that nomination and tried to encourage the president of my party not to continue with that nomination. My first meeting with him was intriguing, somewhat tense, and we've had a very tense relationship in the last 2 years. We clash on virtually everything. However, and this comes to the balance, when it comes to education, I have to say he has backed me at every turn. Last year we had a teachers' strike, to give you my first example, and I wanted to take a softly approach towards the teachers because I realized they had genuine concerns. And I found myself in a minority in cabinet who wanted to use the full force of the law to deal with this strike. And I was left with only the Minister of Finance supporting me, who's also with the MDC. And Mugabe came in right at the end of the debate to back me up. Then there was another issue towards the end of last year regarding a textbook tender where I'd worked with UNICEF, and there were elements in ZANU-PF, got the long knives out and wanted to have a go at me. And Mugabe backed me on that. So he is an intriguing character. I was asked this question by the Australian, is he a monster? Of course, I had to be diplomatic in my reply, and I said...
But you don't have to be too diplomatic tonight.
And let me say this, Robert Mugabe, I have no doubt, is a person who has committed war crimes. He is responsible for a genocide. He is responsible for the destruction of Zimbabwe and for the deaths, indirectly, of hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans in the last 10 years. When you think of the impact of AIDS, never dealt with, compounded by cholera towards the end, it literally caused the deaths of thousands. And that's what he's guilty of. And yet there is this other side to him. And you have to locate everyone in the context of their history. He was treated abominably by Ian Smith. It doesn't excuse what he has done, but it does explain some of it.
Tell me a little bit about the cabinet. You sit in the cabinet. How many people are there in the cabinet? How many white people are there in the cabinet? How does Mugabe display his leadership at that level?
Well, of course, our country is extremely wealthy and we've got this vibrant economy, so we can afford the 39 members who sit in our cabinet. I'm the only white in the cabinet. I represent a black constituency. It's one of the marvels of Zimbabwe, despite all the hate speech and all the political rhetoric which has been directed towards the white community. Fortunately, it hasn't filtered down to the electorate. So the constituency that I represent and have represented in the last 10 years is 98% black. and I stood against black candidates, and they voted me in with a good majority. So it's an intriguing situation. There's still a lot of hate speech, but I encourage you all to come to Zimbabwe. You'll find it's a remarkably peaceful and civil country.
I'd like to ask you a personal question. You chose to stay in Zimbabwe when many others left, and you chose to carry on the campaign for a democratic country from inside at great personal risk to yourself. Can you explain that decision? Why did you take that particular decision?
Well, let me answer that in a variety of ways. I'll answer it as I do Americans when they ask me. Every country goes through turmoil. I'm sure that America in 1860 wasn't a particularly pleasant country to live in. Americans could have left, but if they were passionate about their country, they stayed. And Australia has been through tough times, and I'm sure that if Australia went through similar times, God forbid, most of you would love this country so much that you would never want to leave it. And that's the primary reason why I've stayed. Zimbabwe is a magnificent country. It should be the jewel of Africa. It is missing one critical ingredient, namely democracy. When we get it, it's going to boom, and it's going to be one of the nicest places in the world to live in. I suppose the second reason is because of my family. I'm fortunate that I have a wife who shares my vision, and tied into that, we both have a deep-rooted faith. We believe that sometimes we're put into situations, and it's better to work through problems than to avoid them.
Ricardo, you've made some very strong criticisms about your own country. How do you feel about your country? Do you love your country? Do you resent or hate your country? Or do you both love and hate it? How do you explain your feelings towards Argentina? Particularly seeing that you were rejected twice as president.
No, I love my country, and that is the same as Coltart. The explanation why we fight for so many years and why we made so big sacrifice. I love my country. I believe we have an enormous potential, and I believe all my life that we have to give the example. I mean, I have many opportunities in my life, and I believe that I have a sense of obligation to my fatherland. I admire a lot our history. Let me say, my family is an immigrant family. We came to Argentina at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century.
From where?
From Ireland and from the Vascongadas. The main hero of Argentina is an Irishman, who was the chief of the Navy, and Willie Brown. And my grandfather said all the time that this is the key explanation why we have to be successful, because we have an Irish as the main important hero. And well, we are in love with our country, and we are linked to that. And why we will resign our fatherland to these crazy people? I am not ready to yell, and I will not give up. They say that I am hard, the people that have a strong will to fight. I have been defeated so many times that I say, please, give up. And I said, I will try again. And maybe this comes from Ireland and from the Vascongadas. But it's also because I cannot believe that such incompetent people, such crazy and corrupt people can govern my country. I am in love with my country. I dislike strongly the government we have.
We're living at the moment through a turning point in world economic history, with growth in the established industrialised nations of the United States and Europe low, and the emerging economies are providing a very powerful locomotive both now and projected into the future. If we just talk about your continent, if we just talk about the continent of South America for a moment, what are your feelings about the prospects for South America as we go through the next few decades in terms of the opportunities and the risks? How great are the opportunities, and where might it go wrong?
Okay, I am very optimistic about South America. Why? Because I think the situation will be very good. We have no race problem, no religious problem, no border problem. We are very good friends with our neighbors. We don't have terrorist attack. It's difficult to think that we will have better condition that we are enjoying now. I believe South America is growing very fast. And I correct you because South America is different from Central America and Mexico. Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean depend a lot on the United States. We depend a lot on China, India, and East Asia because we are producer of commodities and our main demand comes from there. If you ask me, I believe South America will grow well above the trend for a long period of time. And I believe if we make the correction in Argentina, that are very simple, very simple. First of all, rule of law. Rule of law, rule of law. Second, common sense in economics. Don't make crazy policies. With these two policies, I think we will be very successful. And despite our policies, I think we will be very successful because the environment of the area is very favorable.
David, if we could just look at the future of Zimbabwe, we've got the national government in power now. How viable do you think this is? Do you think the progress we've seen since the very dark days of 2008 will in fact continue? Or does Zimbabwe really have to wait until Robert Mugabe leaves the scene before there will be new opportunities that open up?
As I said in my main address, it remains very fragile. It's similar to South Africa in the early 1990s. There are hardliners aligned to the military who are determined to derail the progress that has been achieved, and they may still succeed in the short term. There's no guarantee. What gives me hope, however, that this process will continue is the attitude of the region. Fortunately, Zimbabwe, because of its geographical location, is important to the region. Railways go through the country, the electrical grid of the entire region are dependent on Zimbabwe. In the last 10 years, 3 million Zimbabwean economic refugees have flooded into South Africa and Botswana, but they've generally been our middle class. And the region knows that the next wave of refugees, if that happens, will be unemployed, working class, uneducated people, which will be even more of a drain on their economies than the first wave was. So there is a very compelling reason why the region has to deliver on this now. The region has also said to the international community, leave Zimbabwe to us, and so they have a lot of political reputation at stake to make it work. Unfortunately, in the last year or so, since the advent of President Zuma's rule, we have seen him hold Robert Mugabe's toes to the fire and ensure that this political process continues. Turning to your question regarding Robert Mugabe, he's 87. he is, I have to say, disconcertingly fit. He don't believe the stories about his imminent demise. He for an 87-year-old is remarkable. That's the bad news. The good news is that he is increasingly irrelevant. ZANU-PF as a political party is seriously divided. There is clearly a moderate wing now, which on many issues is aligning itself with those of us in the MDC. And they recognize that this arrangement provides them with the political exit. And so that combination with regional pressure, I think, may get us through some of these bumps.
I recognise that you've got different parties and representation in the cabinet, but I'm terribly impressed by the frankness with which you talk about your cabinet colleagues, in particular the head of your cabinet. I think that there's a lesson there for Australian ministers, some of whom I see in the audience. I'd like to finish up by asking you about South Africa. Clearly, the fate of Southern Africa depends so much on the progress of South Africa amid all its difficulties. Can you just give us a snapshot as far as you're concerned about your assessment about the prospects for South Africa? Are you an optimist about South Africa? And what is it about South Africa that does concern you?
Well, South Africa has certain inherent strengths, but its viability is dependent on it maintaining its economic growth rates that it has enjoyed since 1994. The problem about South Africa is that there remains a huge gulf between rich and poor. Certainly the largest gulf in Africa. And whilst this gulf is not absolutely defined in racial terms, it is largely defined in racial terms. White people tend to be wealthy, poor people black people tend to be poor. And that division and the anger that it causes has been contained because there have been substantial growth in the South African economy. But if there was some disruption to that, if they do not maintain the economic growth rate, I have no doubt that those tensions will be exacerbated and may explode in South Africa. It comes back to the point I made about Zimbabwe just now. South Africa in particular, although our economy is relatively small compared to South Africa, desperately needs Zimbabwe to work so that some of the 3 million people in South Africa start to return to Zimbabwe, and that frees up their own job market.
In South Africa, you've got the economic divide reflecting a racial divide, haven't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. In South Africa, in practical terms, you've got shopping malls that are that equate to any American shopping malls, but they are largely populated by white people. And at the other extreme, you have shacks in South Africa that we don't see in Zimbabwe. And 100% of the people who occupy the shanty towns are black.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, when Greg Lindsay decided that he wanted to alter the opening night of Concilium and have a session involving both Argentina and Zimbabwe, I think he was being extremely audacious. But our two speakers tonight are remarkable individuals. The contribution they've made to their nations in adversity is quite extraordinary. I hope you've enjoyed the night. I'd like you to show your appreciation in the normal way to both Ricardo and David.
And also please thank Paul for his adjudication.